Seven Military K9s broke formation in the middle of a federal retirement ceremony just seconds after a volunteer quietly stopped a teenage girl at the entrance. "I'm sorry," he said, lowering his voice. "This seating area is reserved for military families. You'll need to sit in the back." A few nearby guests glanced at her before turning away. Someone muttered, "She doesn't belong here." The girl never argued. She simply nodded, walked to the very last row of the bleachers, the seat closest to the exit that nobody wanted, and folded her hands quietly in her lap. Then everything changed. Seven Military K9s broke formation at the exact same moment and ran straight toward her. Handlers shouted commands that should have stopped a dog cold. The dogs ignored every one of them. 300 uniformed officers and their families fell silent as the animals pushed past metal folding chairs, knocked over a flag stand, and surrounded the thin girl in the faded denim jacket. She hadn't called to them. She hadn't moved toward them. She had simply been sitting there when the lead dog, a German shepherd named Atlas, lifted his head, froze mid-stride, and abandoned his handler entirely. Within 4 seconds, 6 more dogs had done the same thing. A base commander rose halfway out of his chair. A young handler named Corporal Reyes yelled, "Atlas heel," 3 times, his voice cracking on the 3rd attempt, but Atlas never even flicked an ear. The German shepherd sat directly in front of the girl and released a long, low whine that silenced the entire gymnasium. Then the girl did something that made an entire row of decorated veterans go pale. She reached out slowly, as though afraid the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly, rested her hand gently on Atlas's head, and whispered a single name, not her own. A name that belonged to someone almost everyone had forgotten, someone the army had quietly closed the file on years earlier. Atlas's entire body changed the instant he heard it. Nobody in that gymnasium understood what they were watching. Not yet. But by the end of that day, every officer who had looked right through that girl without seeing her would be standing at attention, ashamed of themselves, and grateful they'd been wrong. This is the story of Hannah Doyle, the girl nobody saw, and the dogs who never forgot her father. Before we get to that gymnasium, before the dogs broke formation and the whole base went quiet, you need to understand who Hannah Doyle actually was, because almost nobody in that room did. That's the whole tragedy of this story, and it's also the heart of it. Hannah Doyle was 16 years old, and for the past 3 years, she had lived with her aunt in a small rented duplex on the edge of town, 20 minutes from Fort Drayton, the base where the ceremony was being held that day. She wore the same denim jacket to nearly everything, a hand-me-down 2 sizes too big, because her aunt worked double shifts at a packing plant and there wasn't extra money for things like new coats. Hannah didn't complain about it. She wasn't the kind of girl who complained about much of anything. She kept her hair pulled back in a plain ponytail, carried a school backpack with a broken zipper she'd fixed herself with a safety pin, and had a habit of sitting in the back of any room she walked into, the way people do when they've learned, the hard way, that being noticed isn't always a good thing. Most people who saw her around town didn't know her last name. The few who did know it only knew it because of whispers. The kind small towns are good at, the kind that follow a family long after the reason for them has been mostly forgotten. Some folks remembered, vaguely, that her father had been some kind of soldier once. A few remembered that something bad had happened to him, though most couldn't say exactly what, only that he was gone now, and that the girl had come to live with her aunt not long after. Hannah had been invited to that day's ceremony almost by accident. Her aunt cleaned offices on base twice a week, and one of the administrative staff, a kind older woman named Mrs. Pruitt, had mentioned that the K9 unit would be performing a demonstration and that Hannah, who'd once mentioned in passing that she liked dogs, might enjoy coming along to watch. Hannah had almost said no. She didn't love crowds, didn't love rooms full of uniforms, didn't love the particular kind of silence that settled over her whenever she was somewhere that reminded her, even faintly, of her father. But she'd come anyway, mostly because she didn't want to disappoint Mrs. Pruitt. And she'd slipped into the very back row of the bleachers where nobody would think to look twice at her. Some of the younger soldiers near the bleachers that morning hadn't even registered she was there at all. A couple of officers' kids had walked right past her on their way to better seats, glancing at her jacket, her worn sneakers, the quiet way she held herself, and deciding without a word that she wasn't worth a second look. One young lieutenant's wife had actually asked her to scoot down so a family of 4 could sit together, not unkindly, just thoughtlessly. The way people sometimes treat folks they've already decided don't matter much. Hannah had scooted down without a fuss. She was used to making herself smaller than she actually was. There was a stillness in her, a quiet that looked, to careless eyes, like emptiness. People mistook her silence for a girl who simply had nothing going on behind her eyes. They saw a teenager in a thrift store coat, sitting alone at a ceremony she had no obvious reason to be at, and they assumed there was nothing more to the picture than that. They had no idea what they were looking at, because underneath that faded denim jacket, underneath 3 years of small-town whispers and empty seats beside her at school lunch tables, Hannah Doyle was carrying something that not one soul in that gymnasium could have guessed. A name, a memory, a grief so old it had become part of the shape of her, the way a scar becomes part of a hand. She kept it buried for a reason. Hannah had learned, at 13 years old, that some things are easier to carry quietly than to explain out loud, especially to people who only ever seem interested in asking questions when there's a story in it for them. She believed that with her whole heart. She just never counted on the dogs, remembering what she'd spent 3 years trying to carry alone. The retirement ceremony that afternoon wasn't for Hannah or for anyone connected to her. It was for Major General Daniel Hargrove, a respected commander finishing out 32 years of service, and the entire base had turned out to honor him. Folding chairs lined the gymnasium floor in neat rows. A podium stood draped in the flag. The base's K9 unit, 7 dogs and their handlers, had been brought in to perform a formation demonstration as part of the ceremony, a crowd favorite, sharp and disciplined, the kind of thing that made families in the audience swell with pride. Hannah sat in the very back row, exactly where she'd planted herself an hour earlier, hands folded in her lap, watching the dogs line up across the gymnasium floor with the kind of quiet, careful attention most people in that room weren't giving her at all. Corporal Reyes brought the K9 unit out for their demonstration right on schedule. 7 dogs, 7 handlers, moving in tight, practiced formation across the gymnasium floor. The crowd murmured in appreciation. Our cameras came up. Children pointed, and then Atlas stopped. He wasn't the youngest dog in the unit, but he was the sharpest, a 5-year-old German shepherd, with a record of flawless obedience and 2 deployments behind him. Reyes had handled him for almost 2 years and had never once seen him break formation, not during gunfire simulations, not during crowd noise drills, not ever. Atlas's head snapped toward the bleachers. His ears went rigid, and before Reyes could even register what was happening, the dog was moving, fast, low, focused, cutting straight across the open floor toward the last row of the bleachers, where a 16-year-old girl nobody had paid the slightest attention to all morning sat frozen with her hand half raised to her mouth. Atlas, heel! Reyes shouted, his voice sharp with command, the same tone that had stopped this dog cold 1,000 times before. Atlas didn't slow down. What happened in the next 10 seconds is the part that everyone on that base would talk about for years afterward. The part that turned an ordinary military retirement ceremony into something nobody who was there would ever forget. The other 6 dogs broke too. One by one, almost like a current passing through water. Each dog abandoned its handler and turned toward the same spot in the bleachers. Bodie, a Belgian Malinois, usually so locked onto his handler's hand signals that he barely blinked without permission, simply stopped mid-stride and pivoted. Daisy, the unit's youngest dog, still finishing her advanced training, let out a sharp bark and bolted before her handler could even reach for her leash. Within 4 seconds, all 7 dogs were moving in the same direction, ignoring every command shouted after them, ignoring the startled crowd, ignoring everything except the girl sitting alone at the back of the room. 300 people went dead silent. Major General Hargrove, mid-speech at the podium, stopped talking entirely. Families in the audience rose halfway out of their seats. A few of the younger handlers actually laughed nervously, assuming it was some kind of staged surprise, some part of the demonstration nobody had told them about. But the handlers running after their dogs, red-faced, embarrassed, shouting commands that were being completely ignored, knew this wasn't staged. This was something else entirely. Hannah Doyle sat very still as 7 highly trained military dogs surrounded her, climbing the bleacher steps 2 at a time, and for the first time in 3 years of making herself small and unnoticed, every single eye in that building was locked onto her. She didn't look afraid. That was the strange part that people would mention later, again and again, when they retold the story. A normal teenager, suddenly encircled by 7 working dogs bred and trained for protection and aggression, should have frozen in fear, should have shouted for help, should have done something. Hannah simply lowered her hand from her mouth, slid down off the bleacher bench until she was almost level with the dogs, and reached out toward Atlas with a kind of certainty that didn't match a girl who, as far as anyone in that gymnasium knew, had never been within 10 feet of a military working dog in her life. Atlas got there first. The dog pressed his head directly into her open palm and made a sound that wasn't a growl and wasn't a bark. It was a long, trembling whine, the kind of sound a dog makes when it's been waiting an unbearably long time for something it had stopped believing would ever come. Atlas, no down. Reyes was climbing the bleachers now, his face flushed with humiliation in front of the entire base. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I don't know what's gotten into him." He stopped talking the moment he got close enough to see Hannah's face and to hear what came out of her mouth next. Hannah looked up at the young corporal, then back down at the dog pressed against her hand, and she said, very quietly, almost like she was speaking to herself, "It's okay. He's looking for someone. I think he might be looking for my dad." Then she turned her attention fully to the dog, lowered her voice even further, and said a name. Just a name. The kind of name that belonged to a man, not a command, not a phrase out of any training manual, just a name that every working handler in that gymnasium would later swear had no business meaning anything to a teenage girl in a thrift store coat. Daniel Doyle. Atlas's ears flattened, then shot forward. The dog let out a sharp, almost startled bark and pressed his entire body against Hannah's legs. The way a dog leans into someone it has decided it will not be separated from again. The other 6 dogs settled around her in a loose half-circle, calm now, watchful, the way dogs position themselves around someone they consider one of their own. Corporal Reyes stood frozen on the bleacher step below her, staring at the girl like he'd just watched a ghost climb down out of the rafters. How Reyes finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know that name? And why does Atlas know it?" Hannah didn't answer right away. She just kept her hand resting on Atlas's head, her eyes distant, looking at something none of them could see. The gymnasium had gone completely silent. 300 people, including a 2-star general standing frozen at the podium, were all staring at the same impossible scene. 7 elite military working dogs gathered protectively around a 16-year-old girl in the back row, waiting for her to explain herself. And Hannah Doyle, for the first time in 3 years, finally looked like she understood that she could not simply slip quietly out of the back row of this one. Major General Hargrove came down off the podium himself. That alone told everyone in the gymnasium how seriously this was being taken, because generals do not leave their own retirement ceremonies to walk across a gym floor and climb a set of bleachers unless something has genuinely stopped them in their tracks. "Young lady," Hargrove said, addressing Hannah with a level of formality nobody had used toward her all morning, "would you mind telling me what just happened here?" Hannah rose slowly to her feet, Atlas staying pressed against her leg the entire time, like the dog had no intention of being more than 6 inches away from her ever again. "I couldn't tell you exactly, sir," Hannah said. "I haven't been around dogs like these before. I didn't expect any of them to react to anything at all. I said my dad's name, because that's the only thing I could think to say. He used to talk about a dog all the time. Before what?" Hargrove asked gently. Hannah's jaw tightened. "Before he died, sir." Hargrove glanced around at the dog, still sitting calmly around the girl, then back at her. "Miss," he said, "I think the ceremony can wait. I think we need to have a longer conversation, and I think we need to have it somewhere quieter than this." That was the moment the investigation began, though nobody called it that at the time. It started simply with Sergeant First Class Maria Delgado, the base's K9 unit supervisor, pulling Hannah aside into a quiet side office while the crowd was gently encouraged to take a short recess. Delgado had run K9 units for 14 years. She had trained dogs alongside 3 different branches of the military and had never, not once, seen 7 separate animals from 7 separate handlers break formation simultaneously for the same unfamiliar civilian, let alone a teenage girl with no military connection on paper at all. "Hannah," she said, sitting across from her with a notepad she wasn't really using, "you said your father's name, and Atlas reacted like he recognized it. These dogs have never met you before, is that right?" "That's right," Hannah said, her voice small but steady. "And your father, can you tell me his full name, and anything you remember about his service?" Hannah twisted the edge of her jacket sleeve between her fingers. "Daniel Doyle. He was Army. He was gone a lot when I was little, on deployments, I think, though he never really explained much of it to me. He came home different the last time, quieter. He used to talk about a dog he worked with overseas, a German shepherd. But I was young, and I don't remember the name he used. I just remember he loved that dog more than almost anything he ever talked about. He died when I was 13, car accident, on a back road outside town, late at night. The police said he probably fell asleep at the wheel." Delgado kept her face steady, but something in her eyes had sharpened. "Hannah, do you know if your father's service record mentioned a K9 unit specifically, or any documentation about a dog he might have worked with?" "Nobody ever really told me details like that. My aunt has a box of his things, medals and some papers, but she's never gone through it with me. I think it's hard for her too." It wasn't an answer that solved anything outright, but it was enough of one to make Delgado realize this wasn't a coincidence, and that the quiet girl, sitting across from her, was connected to something the base needed to look into properly. What she found, over the following 2 hours, would change the entire tone of that base for good. It started with personnel records, which, after some searching, turned up a specialist, Daniel R. Doyle, who had served 11 years in the Army, the final 4 of them assigned to a forward K9 support unit overseas. His file listed 2 deployments and an honorable discharge 5 years before his death, followed by what the record vaguely described as ongoing readjustment difficulties, a phrase Delgado had learned over the years usually meant something far heavier than the words let on. What made her sit up straight in her chair, though, was a single line buried in an old incident log from Doyle's final deployment. It referenced a K9 team assigned to his unit, call sign Atlas Actual, and noted that specialist Doyle had served as an auxiliary handler during an extended mission when the primary handler had been wounded and evacuated. Delgado stared at the screen for a long moment before picking up the phone and calling Major General Hargrove directly. "Sir," she said, "I think you need to see this. I think the girl in that gymnasium is the daughter of a soldier who once handled Atlas himself, years before Atlas ever came to this base. And I think that dog has been carrying the memory of her father this entire time, waiting for something to bring it back. What none of them knew yet, what would only come out over the following hour, through careful conversation, an old shoebox of medals finally opened with trembling hands, and a single faded photograph Hannah had no idea even existed, was that Daniel Doyle hadn't just worked alongside a K9 team during one difficult stretch of deployment. He had once carried that very dog through enemy fire on his own back. After the original handler went down, refusing to leave the animal behind, even when ordered to. And the reason nobody at Fort Drayton ever connected his daughter to that story was the same reason so many quiet families slip through the cracks after a soldier comes home changed and never gets the chance to fully heal. Stories like this remind us how many quiet acts of loyalty and sacrifice slip through the cracks of memory, forgotten by everyone except the people and the animals who lived them. That's part of why stories like Hannah's deserve to be found and told before they're lost for good. It was General Hargrove himself who finally asked Hannah, gently, sitting across from her in that small side office with Sergeant Delgado's research spread out on the tables, between them, if she would be willing to tell them everything she remembered about her father, even the hard parts. Hannah looked at the old incident log printout for a long time before she spoke. When she finally did, her voice had changed, steadier, older, somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with how young she actually was. "My dad didn't talk about the war much," she said, "but there was this one story he told me, just once, when I was maybe 10. He said there'd been a dog overseas, not his dog originally, but one he ended up taking care of for a while after something happened to the dog's handler. He said the dog got hurt bad, and everyone told him to leave it, that it wasn't his job, that the mission came first. He said he carried that dog almost 2 miles through some of the worst terrain he'd ever seen, because he couldn't make himself leave a living thing behind that had already given everything it had." Delgado's pen had stopped moving entirely. "He told me the dog made it," Hannah continued. "He told me they patched it up and sent it back to work eventually, somewhere else, some other unit. He said he never found out what happened to it after that. He used to say he hoped, wherever that dog ended up, that it had a good life, that it got to grow old somewhere safe." She glanced down at Atlas, who had not moved from her side since the moment she'd first touched him, and who was now watching her with an expression that, if a dog could manage recognition, looked exactly like it. After my dad died, Hannah said, her voice catching slightly. I went through a box of his stuff once, when my aunt wasn't looking. There was a photo in there, real old, kind of faded, just my dad, way younger, sitting in the dirt somewhere hot, with a German shepherd lying across his lap like it weighed nothing at all. He never told me the dog's name in that picture. I always wondered, what do you think it was that Atlas recognized first? Was it the sound of her father's name somehow still living inside a working dog's memory, all these years and several handlers later? Was it something in the particular way Hannah carries herself, a gentleness her father might have had too, the kind dogs seem able to sense in people without ever being told? Or was it simply that some bonds, the ones formed under fire, between a soldier and a dog who refuse to leave each other behind, never really fade, no matter how many years or miles or new handlers come between them? Let us know what you think before we get to the rest of it. Hargrove sat back slowly in his chair. Hannah, he said, do you understand what your father did? Carrying a wounded military working dog under fire, refusing a direct order to leave it, is the kind of thing units remember for generations, even if the man who did it never gets his name attached to the story. Atlas's full service record lists him as recovered from a serious combat injury sustained on a deployment 11 years ago. I'd put real money on the fact that your father is the reason this dog is alive at all, and the reason he ended up here, on this base, all these years later. Hannah's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. Nobody ever told me that. Nobody ever said my dad did anything like that. People in town just remember him as the guy who came home different, the guy who had a hard time. Nobody ever talks about what happened before that. With respect, Delgado said quietly, I think today proved that what happened before mattered more than anyone in this town ever gave him credit for, and Atlas didn't forget. Not for 1 second across all these years. It was Hargrove who asked the final gentle question, the one that had been sitting unspoken in the room since Hannah first mentioned the photograph. Do you still have that picture? Hannah nodded, reaching into the front pocket of her backpack, the one with the broken zipper held shut by a safety pin, and pulled out a small, worn photograph she had clearly been carrying close to her for a very long time. The edges were soft from handling. The colors faded almost to sepia. A young soldier sat cross-legged in the dirt, a German shepherd lying heavily across his lap, both of them looking straight at the camera with an exhausted, easy kind of contentment. This is him, she said, setting it gently on the table. I've kept it in my backpack since the day I found it. 3 years. I never told anyone why. Nobody at that table said anything for a long moment. Sergeant Delgado picked up the photograph carefully, studied the young dog in the image, and then looked up at Atlas, who was still pressed against Hannah's leg, and back down at the photograph again. Sir, she said quietly to Hargrove, her voice unsteady, I need you to look at this scar pattern along the dog's left flank in this picture, and then I need you to look at Atlas. Hargrove leaned in. The room went very still. The scar was the same one. By the time the room finished absorbing what that meant, Hannah was crying quietly. Not from sadness exactly, but from something harder to name, the particular ache of finally having proof, real and undeniable, that the father she'd lost had once done something extraordinary, something worth remembering, something far bigger than the quiet, struggling man most people in that town had only ever seen the worst of. Your father, Hargrove said softly, carried this dog, this exact dog, and 11 years later, that same dog just ran across a gymnasium full of 300 people to find his daughter. When Hannah Doyle walked back into that gymnasium 15 minutes later, Atlas, walking calmly, at her side on a leash, Corporal Reyes had quietly handed over, Without being asked, she was still wearing the same faded denim jacket. Nothing about her appearance had changed. But the way every single person in that room now looked at her had changed completely. General Hargrove stepped back up to the podium, and the room quieted instinctively, sensing this wasn't going to be the closing remarks they'd been expecting. Before we conclude today's ceremony, Hargrove began, I need to share something with all of you. Something I only learned myself in the last 2 hours, and something I am ashamed to admit this base should have known a long time ago, he told them. All of it. A soldier named Daniel Doyle, who carried a wounded military working dog nearly 2 miles through hostile terrain rather than leave it behind, who came home changed in ways nobody around him fully understood, who passed away 5 years later without ever being publicly recognized for what he'd done since overseas, and a daughter, 16 years old, who had quietly carried his memory and one faded photograph in the bottom of a backpack for 3 long years, never once telling anyone the weight she was carrying. You could hear the room shift as he spoke, chairs creaking as people leaned forward. A woman in the 3rd row pressed her hand to her mouth. An older veteran near the back, a man with his own service cap resting on his knee, slowly rose to his feet without anyone telling him to. For 3 years, Hargrove said, this young woman has sat in the back rows of rooms, just like this one, and not one of us thought to ask who her father was, or what he might have given for this country and for one dog who couldn't speak for himself. Today, 7 of our own K9 unit dogs answered that question for us, in the only language they know how to speak. Loyalty doesn't expire, and apparently neither does memory. Not for a good dog, and not for the family of the man who once carried him to safety. He turned to Hannah, who stood quietly to the side, Atlas seated calmly beside her, having refused to so much as glance away from her since the moment he'd first reached her in the bleachers. Miss Doyle, Hargrove said, on behalf of this base, and on behalf of every soldier whose work today rests, in some part, on the courage your father showed on a battlefield, none of us were there to witness. I would like to formally and finally make sure your father's name is remembered the way it should have been all along. What happened next is the moment people who were there still talk about, the moment that turned an ordinary retirement ceremony into something the local paper would run on its front page the following week. Every single person in that gymnasium rose to their feet, not in scattered applause, but together, all at once, the way a room rises when something true has finally been said out loud. The 7 K9 handlers, Corporal Reyes among them, walked forward and one by one gently shook Hannah's hand, several of them too overcome to manage more than a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am. Your father was one of ours." The old veteran near the back, the one who had stood up early, made his way down the aisle and snapped a slow, deliberate salute, not to a general, not to a dog, but to a 16-year-old girl standing where her father's name had just finally been spoken out loud in public for the first time in years. Hannah Doyle, the girl who had spent 3 years making herself small enough to be overlooked, stood in the middle of it all, with Atlas pressed against her leg. And for the first time since her father died, she let people see exactly how much it meant to finally be seen. She didn't say much. She wasn't used to being the one people listened to. But when Hargrove asked if she had anything she wanted to share with the room, Hannah took the microphone with hands that weren't entirely steady, looked out at 300 faces, and said the only thing that felt true enough to say. I spent a long time thinking nobody really wanted to know who my dad was, underneath everything that happened to him after he came home. Today, this dog reminded me that some things don't disappear just because people stop talking about them. She glanced down at Atlas, who looked up at her with an expression that, if a dog could manage gratitude, looked exactly like it. I think my dad would be glad to know somebody still remembered him. I think that's all I really wanted, even if I never said it out loud before today. The base didn't let it end there. In the weeks that followed, Fort Drayton's command quietly arranged for Daniel Doyle's role in Atlas's rescue to be formally added to his service record, alongside a letter of commendation presented to Hannah and her aunt at a small private ceremony. They installed a modest plaque near the K9 training field, reading simply, "In honor of Specialist Daniel Doyle, who would not leave a soldier behind, even one with 4 legs, Atlas, after some quiet conversation between Hargrove, Delgado, and Reyes, was eventually approved for an early, honorable retirement from active service, the Army deciding that no working dog had ever earned a peaceful home more clearly than the one who broke formation in front of 300 people to find his way back to the daughter of the man who had once saved his life." These days, if you drive past a small rented duplex outside Fort Drayton in the early evening, you might see a teenage girl sitting on the front steps with a textbook open on her knees, and a German shepherd lying contentedly beside her, head resting against her leg, the way he once rested against a soldier's lap in a faded photograph from a war most people never think about anymore. Hannah still keeps that photograph in her backpack, but these days, when people in town pass her, they know exactly whose daughter she is, and they make sure to say so. Have you ever known someone like Hannah? Someone quiet, someone easy to overlook, who turned out to be carrying a story far bigger than anyone around them ever imagined. Maybe it was a parent who came home from service, changed, and never got the recognition they deserved while they were still here to receive it. Maybe it was a sibling or a grandparent who carried a quiet grief for years without anyone thinking to ask. Or maybe it was a dog of your own, one you've never quite stopped thinking about, even all these years later. We'd love to hear who this story reminded you of. If Hannah and Atlas's reunion touched something in you today, consider leaving a like, so more people who need a story like this one can find it. And if you know someone who loves dogs, or loves a veteran, or simply believes that loyalty like this still exists in the world, share this story with them. They'll be glad you did. We started this channel because we believe there are thousands of stories like Hannah's sitting quietly in the back rows of ordinary rooms, hidden behind thrift store coats and 3 years of silence, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. If that's the kind of story you want to keep discovering, we'd be honored to have you stick around for the next one. Because somewhere out there, right now, there's another quiet daughter, or son, or widow, or parent, carrying a story nobody has noticed yet. And somewhere, there's a dog who already knows exactly who they are.